Imagine a nation on the brink, streets filled with defiance, chants echoing against the walls of centuries-old cities, and a government turning its guns inward. Now imagine a global superpower watching, warning, and weighing powerful options that could reshape not only the region, but the balance of world power. Tonight, we explore Iran's unrest, the United States' response, and what it all means for the future of global geopolitics. To understand today's crisis, we must first go back to the roots of discontent in Iran. In late December 2025, ordinary citizens took to the streets. What began as protests over economic hardship, rising inflation, a sharply devalued currency, and persistent shortages quickly grew into something much deeper, a call for accountability. By early January 2026, Iran's economy was under intense strain. Long-standing issues of water scarcity and energy shortages had already sparked unrest in 2025, including strikes by workers, bakers, truck drivers, and farmers earlier in the year. These protests highlighted how everyday life had become a struggle for many Iranians. For decades, Iran has balanced a complex internal political system where theocratic leadership and elected officials coexist against mounting public frustration. This tension has periodically erupted before, including nationwide demonstrations in 2022 and recurring labor strikes throughout 2025. However, the protests that surged at the end of 2025 were different. They weren't confined to one sector or one city. They spread from Tehran to Mashhad, Isfahan, and beyond, tapping into a deep reservoir of economic frustration and political disillusionment. Thousands poured into the streets, bracing against internet blackouts and government crackdowns to make their voices heard. As the unrest spread, Iran's security forces responded with sweeping force. Videos from inside the country, often amid widespread internet shutdowns, showed clashes between demonstrators and security units. Tear gas, water cannons, and sometimes live ammunition were used to disperse crowds. Human rights groups reported that hundreds of protesters have been killed, with at least 500 deaths widely cited, and more than 10,000 detained in the span of weeks. These figures are hard to verify independently due to communications blackouts imposed by authorities, but they paint a grim picture. The government's response has been uncompromising, aiming to quell unrest quickly, yet further inflaming public anger. In some regions, authorities have threatened the harshest penalties for participation in protests, even hinting at possible death sentences for leaders of the movement. Meanwhile, ordinary Iranians, from students to shopkeepers, navigate a world where the price of basic goods can fluctuate daily, and speaking out carries serious risk. This backdrop of economic insecurity and political repression has turned protests into a test of national stability. Amid this internal turmoil in Iran, the United States, under President Donald Trump, has issued a series of stark warnings. In January 2026, Trump said the U.S. was reviewing what he described as very strong options in response to the Iranian government's violent crackdown on protesters. Speaking from Air Force One, Trump said the situation was being monitored hourly. He suggested Iran may be nearing a red line, a point at which the U.S. would feel compelled to act. He refused to specify what those options entailed, but he made clear that the U.S. military was evaluating possible responses. Among these options may be enhanced sanctions, cyber operations targeted at Iranian infrastructure, or even military strikes against regime or strategic assets. Senior officials are reported to be briefing Trump and the White House on a range of courses of action. At the same time, the Iranian leadership has begun signaling that it may want to open talks. According to U.S. statements, Iranian officials reached out to propose negotiations with Washington, a development that underscores the complexity of the moment. Trump indicated that any such meeting could still occur, but added that Washington may have to act before the meeting if the crisis deepens. This juxtaposition of diplomacy and military threat has created a high-stakes diplomatic dance between the two nations. Iran's government has rejected U.S. warnings as interference in its internal affairs. State officials have blamed foreign powers for fomenting unrest and argue that external actors are trying to destabilize the country. Tehran has also warned that any U.S. military action would be met with retaliation. Iranian officials have stated that American and allied military assets in the region would be considered legitimate targets if attacked, raising the specter of a broader conflict in an already volatile region. Beyond the immediate actors, regional powers are watching closely. Nations like Israel and members of the Gulf Cooperation Council are attentive to any sign of U.S. engagement with Iran, given long-standing tensions over nuclear and security issues. Other global powers, including Russia and China, have historically resisted U.S. pressure on Tehran and may view these developments through the lens of broader rivalries with Washington. International organizations and world leaders have urged restraint, calling for protection of human rights and restoration of communications. The United Nations and other global bodies have repeatedly highlighted the need for dialogue and a peaceful resolution. So, what does this all mean for the United States and the wider world? If the U.S. were to take military action, even limited strikes, the consequences could be far-reaching. These actions might deter further abuses or bolster protest movements, but they could also unite elements of the Iranian population behind the regime, complicating internal dynamics. Additionally, any strike risks civilian casualties and regional escalation beyond Tehran's borders. For U.S. allies like Israel, heightened confrontation with Iran might be welcomed in some policy circles, yet it also risks dragging those allies into unwanted conflict. European partners, meanwhile, have historically preferred diplomatic avenues over military escalation. Globally, this crisis compels other powers to clarify their positions. Russia and China might view U.S. pressure on Iran as an opportunity to reinforce alternative security and economic partnerships, deepening geopolitical fault lines. Meanwhile, international institutions face pressure to uphold human rights norms amid competing national interests. At its core, this situation raises questions about the role of external powers in internal political upheavals. When does support for human rights become interference? How should global leadership balance moral imperatives with strategic calculations? These are not easy answers, but they are essential to understanding the stakes at play. As this moment unfolds, the world watches with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Hope for a future where the voices of ordinary Iranians can be heard and their grievances addressed. Apprehension because the path from protest to peace is never simple, and the involvement of global powers only raises the stakes. For the United States, the decisions made in the coming days and weeks may define its posture in the Middle East for years to come. For Iran, this may be a pivotal chapter in a long history of tension between authority and aspiration. In the end, this conflict, like so many others, reminds us that the pursuit of freedom and stability often unfolds amid great uncertainty. As observers, we must ask, what role should external powers play in internal struggles of sovereign nations, and how can the world support human dignity without descending into wider conflict? Thank you for watching The Silent Watch. Stay informed, stay thoughtful, and stay aware.